afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Karen Sampson-Hoffman, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, What You Need to Know About Students with ADHD and Anxiety. Today's webcast is part of the National Resource Center on ADHD's Ask the Expert webinar series. The NRC is funded by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and provides reliable, science-based information about current medical research and ADHD management. During this webinar, we would love to hear from you. You can ask questions or share comments at any time during the presentation. Dr. Willard will answer questions after the presentation is complete. Also, there is a box labeled Resources where you can download today's slides. If we don't get your questions today, we have health information specialists available Monday to Friday from 1 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. You can reach them at 1-800-233-4050. It is a pleasure to introduce today's expert, Dr. Christopher Willard. Dr. Willard is a psychologist, author, and educational consultant who specializes in mindfulness with adolescents and young adults. He has been practicing meditation for nearly 20 years. He currently serves on the board of directors at the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy and is president of the Mindfulness in Education Network. He is the author of Child's Mind, Growing Up Mindful, Raising Resilience, and other books on child development. He leads popular workshops worldwide and teaches at Harvard Medical School. Again, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Christopher Willard. Doctor, if you would like to begin today's Ask the Expert presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here talking about ADHD and anxiety and where we can bring in mindfulness, which may seem almost impossible for, especially those of us that struggle with attention or for kids that struggle with attention. And we also know how much anxiety and ADHD can look a lot like each other. And kind of struggling with some of the same challenges. But also, folks who struggle with both ADHD and anxiety are often very folks who have a number of phenomenal strengths at the same time. So I tend to think about people with ADHD and anxiety as being particularly creative, often really bright, and in a way that just requiring a simple shift to have it kind of work to their advantage almost in some ways. So I think about this often when I work with folks with anxiety and ADHD. It's like it really is some of the most creative people that have anxiety, because if you think about it, right, a creative person can think of about 100 different ways a situation is going to go wrong. A kid is going to fail a test, or the party's going to be a nightmare, or something like that. Whereas someone who's not so creative, who doesn't have an ability to come up with that many ideas, can only think of maybe two ways the scenario is going to go wrong. And of course, we also know that ADHD is about being kind of having a lot of creativity, having a lot of ideas, and just trying to learn how to in some ways filter some of those down. It's that abundance of attention rather than the deficit of attention. That's really what ADD and ADHD are about. So what I'd like to do is actually start with a short mindfulness practice, talk a little bit more about mindfulness as we go, bring in a couple practices, and then basically just open it into questions for you guys. And so with that, what I'll invite you to do is just find a comfortable posture. You can just allow yourself to sit up straight. And if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes. And I'll just ring the bell. Hopefully you can hear this. And just listening to the sound of the bell as it fades. And then just bring to mind one of your favorite places. Maybe it's a place where you go on vacation, a place from childhood, a place where you feel comfortable, safe, relaxed. For kids, young people, maybe it's an imaginary place. Hogwarts from Harry Potter, Wakanda from Black Panther. And just bringing this place to mind, noticing how you feel when you're there. And also noticing pretty quickly that you're probably having some thoughts, having some distractions come in. And each time you notice a thought or a distraction or a worry, just imagine you're just picking it up and setting it aside, just cleaning this place up. Thoughts come in, you can set them aside. Thoughts from the past, noticing that, setting it aside. Thoughts from the future, noticing those, setting each of those aside, just one at a time. Just keeping the image clear. Thought by thought, worry by worry, distraction by distraction. And I'll just ring the bell once more. You can allow your eyes to open again. Maybe just checking in with yourself, noticing if there's been a bit of a shift, a bit more focus, perhaps a bit less anxiety, a bit more clarity. And that's what mindfulness is really about. It really regulates the parts of the brain that are implicated in both anxiety and in ADHD and in executive functioning. So we're doing two things at once. We know that ADHD and anxiety can play off of each other in really nasty ways, but we also know that we can harness them and with many of the same kinds of solutions. Calming down the body, calming down the nervous system, calming down the brain a little bit, shutting off the amygdala response, turning on more of our prefrontal cortex, that kind of thing. So this is just a practice called clearing a space. It's something you can practice yourself when you're struggling with focus. Recommend it to kids. You can make it even more concrete with kids by having them do some drawings and even very literally setting things aside, setting their worries aside one by one. Right? Draw that worry on a piece of paper and really, hold it up to your face. Notice what it's like when it's distracting you there, and then moving it further away and eventually just setting it aside. Or same with a distraction or something that feels really exciting, right? And then holding it right up to your face, taking a few breaths, moving that further away, and setting aside. So those are a few mindfulness-y tricks for managing both anxiety and attention struggles. I want to shift now to talking a little bit about what's happening for our young people in particular. I have this slide here. It says the student paradox. You can pick two. We know that our kids are under tremendous stress, and they really feel like they're just being crushed between all these requirements that they have, all these pressures that we're putting on them every day, right? You can only have studying and sleep, and then you have no friends, or you have sleep and a social life, you're failing your classes, social life and studying, you're getting no sleep, doing all three is impossible. We adults, we could fit in here, parenting, we could try to fit in here our job, our paperwork, right? So many other things. And we know, of course, that for ourselves and for our kids, there's so much more than just these three things that we're all facing. We do know that for our kids, right, the reality is, right, they're not learning how to manage their stress. We're not teaching them how to manage their stress. And that starts to really kick off their anxiety. We know that stress makes everything worse. This big study a few years ago from the American Psychological Association found the most stressed out demographic group in America is actually the American teenager. And, we're not doing much to really help them out with this. So we can think of mindfulness as being like a public health intervention. And in that way, we know that that'll really help things like any attention struggles they're having, any mental health issues like anxiety that they're having, calm everything down. Stress makes everything worse. Managing our stress makes everything better. Mindfulness really manages our stress. In turn, we can start to learn how to deal with things, how to handle the anxiety, the stress, the attention, right, that we know also makes us stressed out. So it's this whole vicious cycle. And of course, we know that there's so much more that our kids are facing besides just these three issues we see up here. So what is mindfulness? Where does it fit in? Well, you may have your own idea of what mindfulness is. I'll share the definition that I like to use, especially when I think about working with kids, because we know working with kids, we start by bringing things into small pieces. So I say mindfulness is paying attention to the present moment with acceptance and non-judgment. Maybe with kindness and curiosity is a little better than acceptance and non-judgment. But basically, this is, three parts here. We can start by, paying attention. Probably we've all been told to pay attention. We've probably all told our kids to pay attention, but so few of us have in fact been taught how to pay attention. Nor have we ever thought to teach our kids how to pay attention. And what kind of message is it if you're a kid, a student who's struggling with anxiety, struggling with attention, and you're being told to do something, but you're never taught how to do that, right? So what we're doing with mindfulness is we're actually teaching our kids how to pay attention, right? So, right, well, anxiety is like the mind racing off to the future, right? And ADHD and mind wandering kind of all over the place, right? We're learning how to kind of control and focus our attention, learning how to pay attention and paying attention to the present moment. This is also really difficult to do because what the research says is that for the average person, not even someone with anxiety, not even someone with ADHD, their mind is wandering. Guess what percentage of the time? It's actually 47% of the time. I have to repeat that. Half of you missed it. Our minds are wandering about half of the time that we're trying to focus. So what we're trying to do is, again, train our minds not to wander quite so much. Where does the research say our minds go? Well, it says it goes to the past, it goes to the future, and it wanders off somewhere else, just kind of ruminating and comparing ourselves to other people. It's called the default mode network. Right? And again, we know anxiety tends to be future-oriented, right? Focused on the future. What's going to happen? It's not going to happen well. Tell myself a very creative horror story about how badly things are going to go. Right? For me in high school, that was, today's Thursday. There's a test next week. Oh my gosh, I'm going to fail the test. I'm going to fail out of school. I'm going to die alone under a bridge. No one's going to come to my funeral. Right? My life is a mess, basically. Right? So what if I don't tell myself that story about the future? If I focus on the present, get myself moving, what can I do? I can study for the test, right? Lastly, just having a little bit more acceptance and non-judgment of our circumstances and of ourselves. This is going to be really valuable for our kids who are struggling with attention issues and with anxiety. Being a bit kinder to ourselves, right? Because kids have been getting these messages, there's something wrong with you because you're anxious. There's something wrong with you because of the way you learn and the way you pay attention or you don't pay attention, right? You're the special ed kid, you're the mental health kid, you're the kid that needs to see the therapist. And over time, right, whether it's from parents or whether it's from the school or whether it's from their coaches or the larger culture, kids internalize those voices. That's what we don't want them to learn, right? To not believe everything they think. So having a little bit more self-acceptance, right? Getting rid of that more critical voice, not believing that critical voice at every moment. So teaching our kids how to pay attention to the present moment, have some more self-acceptance, not judge themselves quite so harshly. This is what we're trying to do as we start to teach them mindfulness. So moving ahead with mindfulness, here's a picture I sometimes use when I'm teaching kids or adults about mindfulness. Right? We can see the human being over here on the left. Probably a lot of us can relate to this. A lot of our kids can relate to this. And with ADHD, we can make this bubble about 5 times bigger than that at any given moment. Human beings in the past and the future, all over the place, anywhere but the present moment. There's no sunshine and no trees in the human being's mind. Meanwhile, the dog, of course, has just the sunshine and the trees, none of that other stuff. Now, the fact is, as human beings, we have to think about the future and the past, but we don't want to get stuck because we start kind of getting into these habits where our mind is always wandering as well, racing off to worry about the future. And then ADHD, being like putting that on steroids, like here's even more scenarios, that we can think of about the future that's maybe not going to go so well. So it's learning how to switch gears really between these. Building actually a neural pathway to be able to get in the present moment when it's helpful to be in the present moment, whether that's in school or whether that's that first day of school vacation, right? It's Friday afternoon. We could be enjoying the trees and the sunshine, and instead we're already worried about Monday. We're already thinking what was happening earlier in the day. Our mind is anywhere but we want it to be. So teaching our kids, teaching ourselves how to be a bit more present, and actually really rebuilding neural pathways to be able to do that too. So just to move forward a little bit, and I'll do a little demonstration here, and then we'll start to move right into some practices. I want to talk about the stress response, which in many ways is effectively the anxiety response. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment and just squeeze your fists really tightly, and just notice what happens when you do this to your breath, to your body, to your mind. Does it feel open or does it feel closed? What's going on like this? Are there times you feel like this? And then just open your hands and relax yourself. And just sitting up straight, just holding your hands palms upright, not so tight, not so loose. And noticing how your body shifts, how your breath begins to shift a little bit. And what's happening in your mind, you might notice that your mind also actually and your brain start to kind of open up a little bit to be able to see more clearly, noticing the kinds of emotions and thoughts you're having in this posture. So what I'm kind of doing here is taking us through the stress response of fight or flight. We also have these other responses, freeze and forget it. We don't need to get into those because fight or flight is what we most often see in the overlap of anxiety and attention issues. So fight being, right, we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger like this poor caveman over here, right? What do we want to do? We want to fight it off or we want to flee from it. Fight being, and over time we get wired so we're fighting all the time. That's when kids start to get aggressive, or we get aggressive. Whether it's physically aggressive or whether it's merely emotionally aggressive and irritable and, snappy and a little bit nasty. The flight response, that's more of anxiety. Avoidance and flight reinforces anxiety. And so the fight-flight response, the flight response is basically an anxiety-based response. That's really useful when we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. It's not so useful when we're being chased by a test on Friday, or trying to find a prom date, or worried about a driver's test, or am I going to get invited to the birthday party, or all these things that our kids are facing every day, and thinking of hundreds of ways it can go wrong because of that, again, intersection of the creativity that happens with anxiety and ADHD and the ways they feed off of each other. What else is happening in the fight or flight mode? Well, the amygdala turns on. That's our caveman brain, most primitive part of the brain that is basically all about fight or flight. It's this alarm system going off. Okay, that's good when we're being chased by a tiger. Not so good in the classroom. Why? Well, because we turn the amygdala on, it shuts off blood flow and energy to the rest of our brain. Right? It shuts off blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. What happens in the prefrontal cortex? Well, we think things through, we control our impulses, we're able to plan and execute, set long-term goals, we're able to see the big picture, right? All this is where our executive functions lie, in the prefrontal cortex. That's shut down when we're anxious, which means that any ability to pay attention that's already compromised from ADHD is going to be even exacerbated by the anxiety. There's like no bandwidth in there. So thinking back, and you can try it again, like making those fists, right? How much are you, like how well are you going to do on a math test right now? Right? How well are you going to be able to process a difficult emotional situation or relationship situation with a friend? Or negotiate a bedtime with your kid? Not so well, because it's really shutting off the bandwidth. And so when that's not working, we get even more impulsivity. Right? And the prefrontal cortex, we know, is a little bit smaller and a little bit less active in people with ADHD and executive function problems and impulse control problems and that kind of thing. We add anxiety into the mix, it shuts down even more. Everyone starts to look like an enemy or a threat. Right? That nice teacher who wants to help me after school, oh, they're just out to get me. My parents are trying to ruin my life. Coach is about to cut me from the soccer team. Start to interpret everything as a threat. How do we act when we start seeing the world as threatening? Well, we act out. And then we already struggling maybe with impulse issues, act out even more, become even more scattered and disorganized, right? Only thinking, how do I get this to end? Not who gets hurt in the process? What are the consequences for me? Right? These kinds of things. So this is where it gets kind of dangerous. What else is happening in the body? This is a little bit less important, but of course, the breath tightens up and heart rate speeds up and all these things like that. Cortisol starts flowing through the body, and that shuts down, it's the stress hormone that also shuts down our ability to learn. We're feeling that when we're anxious or when we're stressed out, right? Other parts of the body start to shut off, digestive and immune systems start to shut off, these kinds of things. So, not good. The more anxious our kids get, the worse the ADHD gets. The worse the ADHD gets, the worse the anxiety gets, right? So it's a vicious cycle. The good news is we can actually shut this cycle down. We stress and we regress into caveman, but we can also get stressed out and progress and be our best selves. We can turn on what are called the attend and befriend systems. And if you, again, sit up straight, holding your palms upward, somewhat outward, you might notice that, right, you feel a little bit more open just by having your hands a bit more open. The breath isn't quite so constricted. And when the breath is open, that also means that our brains are open and our prefrontal cortex is operating at its best. And, a lot of other things start happening, right? The amygdala shuts down, the alarm system. That means blood flows into the prefrontal and insular cortex. Prefrontal cortex, where we think things through, we control our impulses, we see the big picture. Also getting blood flow into the insular cortex. That's where we do a lot of our social reasoning, understand someone's motivations and what their perspective is. Oh, that teacher says, see me after school. Well, maybe they can be helpful. The therapist says, come to my office. Oh, okay, it's not so bad. We play Uno and we talk about strategies, and my parents are not trying to ruin my life. We're able to see things clearly. Our kids are able to see things clearly. It shuts off the anxiety response. Over time, what starts to happen, because of what's called neuroplasticity, is the kids wire their brains, or we wire our brains, to be more in this attend befriend mode all the time. Prefrontal cortex is operating better. The amygdala actually, that inner caveman and alarm system, shuts off and actually gets quieter, gets smaller, so it's not going off all the time, which means we can think a little bit better all the time. What else is happening? The breath starts to become regular and even, as I said. When the breath becomes regular and even, it means actually that everything else is working. Our brain's working and our body's working. So we can actually not only just check in, and you can do this with your kids or with yourself. Just notice when their breathing is labored. They're struggling to pay attention, and they're probably anxious in that moment. I can tell it with my 3-year-old. I can go into a classroom, I can tell. I can have a therapy client in front of me, I can tell how agitated and anxious they are, how focused they are based on their breath. You can probably check in for yourself. And what the research says, I learned this from Kelly McGonigal, who's a stress expert, we can actually use the breath like it's a remote control to change how our body feels, calm down that anxiety, open up the brain, using the breath like a remote control, which is the metaphor I love to use with kids, but it also works great with adults. So what does this mean? Well, what Dr. McGonigal says is, if we slow our breathing rate down to somewhere between 4 and 6 breaths in a minute, this is what calms the body down. This is what shuts the amygdala off and allows blood to start flowing into the prefrontal cortex, blood to start flowing into the insular cortex, where we're able to think things through, control our impulses, shut off the anxiety, open up the brain to be operating at its best, even for kids that do struggle with ADHD, right? And again, right, this is part of why ADHD and anxiety can look a little bit like each other. A lot of the symptoms are the same if you go and look them up in the ICD or the DSM. But also the solutions, the tools we can use, like recalibrating our breath, can be really helpful. So I'll just walk us through a couple breath practices, and then maybe I'll turn it over for questions. So I'm actually going to skip around a bit on the slides because I always bring more than I can get to. So let's start with my favorite for younger kids, the chocolate breath right here. So we imagine you can actually even just hold out your hands as if you're holding a cup or a mug of hot chocolate. And it's really hot. You can imagine it warming up our hands. And then we simply want to breathe in through our nose like we're smelling. And just blowing out through your mouth like you're cooling it off. Breathing in through your nose, smelling. And blowing out through your nose, cooling it off. In through the nose, smelling. And blowing out through your nose, mouth. Just cooling it off. And allowing your breath to reset itself. Checking in with your body. Checking in also with your mind. Noticing, does it feel a bit more settled? Does it feel a bit more clear, even just after maybe 3 breaths? Right? So this simple visualization, we all know what it's like to breathe in, smelling. We know what it's like to blow out, cooling off. And yes, I know kids will get a little bit silly with this potentially. You can actually give them a cup of water and tell them to blow on it without spilling, right? Filled up all the way. Right? So they can actually learn how to do it with something right in front of them. But this is a way of just really slowing the breath down, getting it down to that 4 to 6 breaths in a minute rate, which will be actually a little bit higher with younger kids. So that's fun, but guarantee, some of those middle school kids are going to roll their eyes if you try this with them. So we might want to do something maybe like counting, the 7-11 breath I've got here, and we can see that folks like professional athletes are also doing some of these breathing practices that, again, reset the nervous system, which calms down anxiety and stress response, that flight response. Also shuts off the amygdala, which lets blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, which allows kids to focus who are maybe struggling with attentional issues. In the 7-11 breath, we'll do this together. We simply count in for 7, and we count back out to 11. So breathing in, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and just counting into yourself up to 7. And then back out to 11. And back into 7. And back out to 11. So another short and sweet, simple breath practices. And again, these calm us down and open up the brain. They're doing double duty here. We're also, when we focus on an image, like the hot chocolate, having to remember that we're counting, where's our mind not going? It's not going to, panicking about, the test that's happening next week. It's not going to thinking about the kid sitting next to me who's being silly and should I jump in and be silly also, right? It's bringing the mind back to focus on this particular, right, the image, the counting, whatever it might be, or the sensations of the breath. So that's also helping on that level. So these are a few ways to just use the breath to be able to focus a bit more clearly in helping our kids regulate their breath, which again turns on the brain, shuts off the nervous system's like anxiety response effectively. So here's a few ways in with this, and again, there's nothing magical about these. They're just a little bit fun, and some interesting people do some of these practices. Younger kids might find into 7, out to 11 a bit challenging. So maybe a short word and a long word. Breathe in bird, breathe out brontosaurus. Breathe in horse, breathe out hippopotamus. Right? Breathing in for a little bit shorter and out for a little bit longer helps us slow the breath down, starts to calm us down as well. So what else can we do? This is a practice I've actually just kind of came up with this acronym myself about a month or two ago. It's taking a mindful seat, and it's just an acronym that allows us to just become a little bit more aware of what's happening in our bodies and just focus a little bit more as well. So again, finding a comfortable posture, and I'll ring the bell and just guide us through noticing. First ask just what sensations do you notice in your body? Maybe some agitation, or maybe some feelings of calm, maybe some tension, maybe some movement. For a lot of kids with ADHD or anxiety, there's that leg that's bouncing up and down, or fist clenching, or hands are sweaty. Noticing sensations. And setting the sensations aside and tuning into emotions. What emotions are here? Curiosity, frustration, boredom, just being aware. Silliness, calmness. What emotions are present? Setting those aside. Actions. What actions, what impulses do you want to do? Do you want to jump out of your seat? Do you want to adjust your posture? Do you want to squirm? Noticing what actions you feel like doing. Setting those aside and then just tuning into thoughts. What thoughts are here? What's happening in your thoughts? What's coming next? Or what's this about? Or am I doing this right? Just noticing sensations, emotions, actions, and thoughts. So it's another just really short grounding practice about checking in with what's really happening in the present moment. Another variation on getting a bit more into our bodies that helps us focus is just there's practices like a longer body scan that can be helpful, but for a lot of kids with ADHD and anxiety and just being kids, they're probably not going to be able to focus for 20 minutes, 30 minutes at a time. But maybe just focusing on sensations in one part of the body. Right? Maybe that's simply placing one finger in the center of your forehead. This is something I do sometimes. Teach kids to focus. I call this single tasking rather than multitasking. Just feeling your finger in the center of your forehead. And you can ask yourself, what does your forehead feel like against your finger? What does your finger feel like against your forehead? Temperature, texture, moisture, pressure. Finger against forehead. Forehead against finger. Mind wanders off, just back to the sensations. Maybe even noticing your pulse. And you can just set your finger back down again. So again, narrows the focus a little bit. Is actually really touching that prefrontal cortex. So sometimes with kids who like to learn about their brain, it's like, all right, we're actually going to turn on our prefrontal cortex by pressing that button right there and activating it with this single tasking practice. For older kids, they're going to roll their eyes at that, so maybe not, right? But again, just really focused in on sensations. And our senses are really helpful because the mind, we know, is wandering back to the past, to what was happening at recess before, is wandering, somewhere else. What's that bird doing out the window? Wandering to the future, especially if we're anxious, right? What's going to happen this weekend? Who's going to be home when I get home from school, right? These other questions that kids might have. How's college going to go, right? So, again, sensations always are in the present moment. Ground us right back into the present. I'll just close up with one other just short practice, and I know I kind of mentioned this as single tasking, but I would say in general, right, just single tasking rather than multitasking is I think going to be really important for our kids to as a way of just focusing a little bit more. I seem to have missed out on. Well, here's something on single tasking, right? Actually, can do just one thing at a time. There's this guy at the coffee shop sitting at a table. He's not on his phone. He's not on his laptop. He's just drinking coffee like a psychopath, right? But again, a way we can actually bring more mindfulness to what we're doing is just to do one thing at a time. I have a friend who has an event he just calls "Do One Thing at a Time Day," or find something to do with just all your attention, drinking your coffee, doing the dishes, whatever it might be. That's a way of bringing ourselves into the present moment. But I want to do a last practice of just listening to sounds. This is one of my favorite things to do, actually myself. I don't love breathing practices for my own anxiety, for my own attention difficulties, for my own procrastination. I get bored, I'll admit it, but I really like listening to sounds as a practice. And this is particularly just dovetails with kids with ADHD because their mind is bouncing all over the place. Well, I'll just let you see. We can do this together. Find a posture, close your eyes if that feels all right for you. I'll ring the bell. As I ring the bell, just listening to the beginning and middle and end sound of the bell. And then just continuing to listen to sounds around you. Perhaps just seeing what's the farthest away sound you can hear right now. Outside of the room you're in, maybe even outside of the building that you're in. Planes overhead, cars going by, birds chirping. Farthest away sound, and then zooming in a little bit closer, the next closest sound. Zooming a bit closer, still sounds a little bit closer, maybe sounds in the building or in the room with you. Footsteps going by, clock ticking, sound of the heater, air conditioner. Sounds closer, still the creaking of your chair, rustle of your clothes. Sound of your own breath. Even inside your body, sound of your heartbeat, blood moving, stomach growling. Perhaps even sound of your own thoughts, if that's possible. And I'll ring the bell once more. And once more, just listening for that beginning, middle, and end sound of the bell. And opening your eyes and bringing your attention back out. And maybe, like the mindful seat, just noticing, again, sensations, emotions, actions, and thoughts that are present right now. What's happening in your experience in this moment? And so to me, this is very literally training our attention. For a kid or an adult who struggles with attention, right? Maybe, they're already paying attention to the car going past or the bird chirping out the window. So meet them there, right? And then gradually, right, zooming in like the zoom lens on a camera, getting closer and closer, right, to focusing on what's really happening in the here and now, right? Focusing on your own body sounds, focusing on your own thoughts, and then maybe just outward again, focusing on the teacher and the board, focusing on what your mom or dad is saying to you, focusing on, the fact that you're in the soccer game and trying to bring your mind back into the moment or in the orchestra or wherever it is that you're struggling to focus. So these are just a few ways of teaching our kids how to focus on the present, right? How to use the fact that their minds wander, which will happen with anxiety and ADHD, and again play off of each other in these potentially really negative and awful and frustrating ways for kids, and to turn that around, reframe it. Right? The fact that your mind wanders, well, let's learn about that. Let's see where it goes, and let's focus it back. Train ourselves to be in the present, where we're happier, where we're not worried about the future. Train ourselves to be focused on what we want to be focused on, right? Which is a struggle with ADHD. And kids with ADHD will excel, especially at this like sound countdown, and with anxiety. They'll notice so many more sounds than the average kid. So if you make it a game or something, right, a competition for who can hear the most sounds, they'll really start to have fun with it. They'll feel like a success. They'll feel like they're the ones who are really good at it. So it also builds that self-esteem. So there is so much more I can say about anxiety, about ADHD, about mindfulness, about all of this stuff. I know that our time is limited. I'm sure you've got so many questions, and really feel free to. I'll turn it over to questions now. We've got about 15 minutes for me to answer stuff. I'll put up my email here at the end of the show here, chris@drchristopherwillard.com. If you have any more questions you want to ask me, no problem at all. Here's some shameless self-promotion of my books. Let me turn it over to questions. Okay, let me see if I can figure out how to even answer these questions. All right, we've got a question here. If I can figure out the technology. Can sensory issues lead to ADHD behavior? So I'm assuming Hamamolini, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Forgive me if I'm not, please. Can sensory issues lead to ADHD behavior? Well, we do see a lot of kids increasingly with sensory integration disorder. I assume this is some of what you're referring to. And of course, right, when we think about something like the mindful seat, sensations, emotions, actions, and thoughts, we know that sensations, or our senses, right, it's sort of like a stimulus response thing can happen, right? So that if a sense comes in, it's very uncomfortable, kids are going to behave on that, right? They're maybe going to act out, they're maybe going to jump out of their seat. Even if they're not, a lot of their mental resources, a lot of their prefrontal cortex functioning is going to be dedicated to how am I going to manage my impulses around the sensory discomfort I'm experiencing right now, which means that they have very little bandwidth left over for controlling their impulses and focusing on the teacher, focusing on you, focusing on whatever. It's like they're at, depending on how severe their sensory issues are, it's like that could be taking up like 80 or 90% of their bandwidth. So very little is left, and it's like they're left with some executive function deficits or some prefrontal cortex dysfunction that's going to manifest itself in impulse control issues, in difficulty focusing, in difficulty with planning, in difficulty with seeing things, because it's going to be using up a lot of those resources. So hopefully that answers your question. Do you recommend doing mindfulness in response to a stress or as a practice at a specific time, like a bedtime, like a meditation? The answer is yes, which is to say, Sarah, that I recommend both. So to me, mindfulness is like physical exercise. This is mental exercise. In fact, professional athletes using this even call this mental fitness training. I've been talking to lots of people that are mental fitness coaches that work with professional sports teams and high school sports teams. But basically, we want to be getting ourselves into mental shape by practicing regularly, like maybe before bedtime or first thing in the morning, or doing a little breathing or a little sensory awareness maybe before dinner or at a time where our kids are open to it, right? So that we're building up that muscle so that when the meltdown happens, when the kid is feeling stressed, right, they're more likely to be able to access these practices and use them. So it's not like the meltdown begins and we say, do some hot chocolate breathing, and they're like, what is a hot chocolate breath? Right? We're able to say, like, let's do some hot chocolate breathing together, which is, again, how we want to do this. We're modeling it as we're teaching it. That's really key. And then they're also saying, oh, yeah, I love the hot chocolate breath, right? We can also even simulate maybe a little bit of stress or anxiety. We can tell kids, imagine a stressful situation. Now let's breathe. Now notice how your heart feels. How does your body feel? Now let's breathe and calm ourselves down. One fun way to do this is like watch a suspenseful scene in their favorite movie and notice, oh, my heart rate's getting bigger and my hands are clenching up and I'm breathing more shallowly. Or listen to a suspenseful movie soundtrack, something like that. Listen to the Jaws soundtrack. Notice yourself getting anxious and stressed out, and then breathe your way through it, or feel your feet on the floor, or do the single tasking with your finger against your forehead. And then you're actually really training with resistance, right? Learning how to actually shut down that stress response, that anxiety response, which is going to be even more valuable than just practicing it in fun times. So all of these then make it less likely that the meltdown happens, but also that the kids can access the skill when they're maybe having the meltdown, whether it's around anxiety or whether it's around just the overload that happens in our kids who have ADHD because they don't have the bandwidth, and it's like they're just overtaxed. And then they lose all of their impulse control because they've been trying so hard in school to manage their focus, to manage their anxiety, and it comes out at home, right? They're exhausted. Their brains are exhausted. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's see. Specific books which target ADHD and mindfulness that I can recommend. Some of you guys probably know my good friend Mark Burton. He's written a ADHD, mindfulness and ADHD parenting book, which is fantastic. I've written a mindfulness and anxiety book. There are, let's see, there's other just great books about mindfulness with kids. I've written a few. Susan Greenland's written a few. Amy Saltzman has written a few. Those I all highly recommend. But Mark, I would say, is kind of a go-to guy on ADHD and mindfulness. Oh, Lydia Zylowska, more for adults, the ADHD Mindfulness Solution or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the name of her book is. But those are a few ideas. Yeah. Recording to listen to. I think Robin will have to answer that, but I believe the answer is yes. Suggestions for audio.
Hi, this is Karen. Yes, we will have a recording available, and if you don't see it posted soon, you can give us an email to asktheexpert@chadd.org, and we will send you that link. But it will be posted on both our website and our YouTube page.
Great, thank you so much. Audio guided meditations for kids. A few different resources. I've got a couple you can get. My friend Amy Saltzman has a few. She's called A Still Quiet Place. Those are good. Let's see. Probably if you just go on YouTube, you can find some. I would really recommend, as a parent, that if you can get your kids to buy into this with you, which maybe you can and maybe you can't, if you can, find some scripts online or find some scripts from a book that's out there, guide your kid through this yourself. That's really going to be best because it feels kind of comforting coming from you. You can also record that on your phone, or we don't really have tape recorders anymore. You can record that yourself, and then your kids can listen to it. It feels like it's you, so that feels like a nice thing. Or maybe if they're seeing a therapist or a coach or a tutor or a parent, right? Maybe the parent can record them. So again, a familiar voice is nice. Or you can certainly find audio programs by myself, by Amy Saltzman. There's one app out there called what is it? Stop, Breathe, and Think. Susan Kaiser Greenland, who's wonderful, I think has recorded a few things for that. So those I would recommend as well. Yeah. How do you end the sound countdown to focus on the teacher and not all the other sounds they were just asked to hear? Yeah, this is a good question. So if we guide this in a way that's like, really, sort of with more prompts in it, like, notice the sounds outside. Notice the sounds outside of, the classroom. Notice the sounds inside of the classroom, of other rustling, and set those aside and now really focus on the teacher. I think if we guide them with more prompting, like, and now set those aside and focus on the next thing, and now stop listening to that and focus on the next thing. That really then trains them to be able to shift gears between listening to this and listening to that, and so that they're then ultimately focused on the teacher. So we can actually have them practice setting aside those distractions. And sometimes what happens for kids with sensory issues is this is particularly hard, or kids with anxiety or ADHD, though, is they want to make meaning of those sounds. So once they figure out what it is, then their mind can let go of it, because their mind is not half trying to figure out, what is that? What is that? Oh, it's the radiator. Or, oh, it's, it is a school bus going by. Or, oh, it's that kid tapping his pen over there. Once they figure that out, then the brain is not trying to figure it out, and they can then set it aside. So that, again, the bandwidth of the brain is not being used up by trying to figure out what this particular sound or that particular sound is. And then it becomes easier to let go, to set aside and not focus on quite so much. So that's a suggestion for thinking about that. Won't meditation with eyes closed in classroom to relieve stress be seen as a sign of disrespect or lack of attention? Yes. So this, I think, is really important to think about in terms of, the culture of the school, right? So if your child has an IEP or a 504, something like that, or you're just having a parent-teacher meeting or meeting with the guidance staff or school social worker, psychologist, just letting them know if the child does prefer to close their eyes, that may be what's going on, and so that it's not about disrespect or not paying attention. The other thing is, I encouraged you to close your eyes, but you don't have to for any of these. Right? You can just have like eyes down on the piece of paper and be listening to sounds, or be focused on the 7-Eleven or hot chocolate breath, or be feeling your feet on the floor or something like that. So eyes closed is really not necessary. For some kids, it may make them feel even more distracted. For some anxious kids, it may get them more wound up. Again, every kid is different. There's not like a hard or fast rule around close your eyes, don't close your eyes. I mean, I would say for kids that have had, post-traumatic stress or something, you want to stay away from it. But otherwise, for the most part, every kid is different. Really don't have to have their eyes closed. But again, if they do like doing these practices with eyes closed, I think just heads up to the teacher, heads up to the support team as well. Heidi, how can I as a mom remain positive when my 16-year-old tells people she wants to be a doctor or lawyer? I don't want to crush her hopes, but some of the responses she gets when she tells people what she wants are sure to be heartless. Wow, this is a really challenging question. And I think you don't want to crush her hopes, but I think you can talk to her about, different adults are going to have different kinds of responses. And I think also talking to her about what is realistic. And I think this is one of the hardest things about being a parent, right? We want to have our kids have a growth mindset. We want them to believe that they can do anything, but we also want to protect them from the fact that they can't necessarily. So how do we help them pursue what their interests are, pursue what their passions are, water those seeds, really nurture those, right, in the path that they want to take, right, so that they're doing what they feel good at, doing what they want to do, and most likely to be able to succeed in that realm, knowing that not necessarily everything is possible, and knowing that ultimately at some point it'll be really up to them. I do think if there's adults that are being heartless, disrespectful, rude, I think, we want to be, maybe we do need to still protect our kids from some of those adults. Whether that's talking to those adults about that's not appropriate, or talking to our kid about saying, look, you don't have to listen to every adult. Not every adult knows what they're talking about. Figuring out, again, how does that balance with our family's values around, respecting adults, right? And, but just knowing that, they're not right all the time. So this can be a little bit tricky too. What do I think about doing DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy for those of us that aren't therapists or highly therapized already, to teach kids with ADHD and anxiety tools to cope. Dialectical behavioral therapy is a really great cognitive therapy, and we know that cognitive therapies are really helpful for ADHD. Dialectical behavioral therapy brings in a lot of very practical skills training, and it also brings in mindfulness training. So if I'm recalling this correctly, dialectical behavioral therapy has 4 components. It's got two components that are related to mindfulness, and then a component related to emotion regulation, and then a component related to interpersonal effectiveness. And I think DBT is fantastic. I did some training in DBT in graduate school and a little bit here and there. I actually just found it's like, oh, this is really helpful, just life skills stuff for those of us that didn't get an instruction book. So I think DBT is great for teaching kids with ADHD, teaching kids with anxiety, tools how to cope. I actually think a lot of the skills in DBT would be great for any kid to learn. And for those of you that don't know the world of DBT, I'd encourage you, go ahead and just Google a little bit about it because it's got really good social skills to it. How to be assertive, how to articulate yourself, how to kind of get your needs met using your words rather than using behaviors. So it's great for kids with ADHD and anxiety. It also really teaches how to tolerate difficult emotions. Distress tolerance maybe is what they call it, not emotion regulation. Tolerate difficult emotions like anxiety that can lead to acting out. And again, especially with ADHD, and the impulse control is not as strong necessarily, right, then we're going to see more acting out when it's any mental health issues, whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, whether it's anything else. So I think DBT is great. And if you find a DBT therapist, that's great, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend a DBT group for your kid unless it's really just related to ADHD. Because often that can be, often DBT groups will be for kids that are very troubled, and you may not want to have your kid in that group. But a therapist who's acquainted with DBT, I highly recommend, or even just as a parent, just picking up a book about DBT and just looking through some of the great skills that are in there about mindfulness, about tolerating difficult emotions, about interpersonal effectiveness and assertiveness and that kind of thing. You can do a lot of lessons with your kids around that stuff. How might teachers integrate this mindfulness training into the classroom? From Lexi Wright. Well, this is like my total wheelhouse. I travel around all over the place doing this very work with teachers bringing mindfulness into schools. So, I mean, in the last year, I've probably been to about 30 or 40 different schools talking to teachers about bringing mindfulness in on a number of different levels, whether it's the therapist bringing it in, whether it's running a group with kids, or whether it's teachers just bringing this in like as part of test prep, right? Like you can get the kids, all the information into their brain for something, like the big test coming up. But if they're too anxious, right, if they're in that fight or flight response, nothing's getting in and nothing's going to get out the day that they have the test. And so, we can, I like to say, just a little bit of your lesson planning around self-regulation, around stress management, and your kids will perform better academically because more will get in and more will come out when the moment really comes. So it's finding those little moments in the day, bringing it into public speaking, into drama, bringing it into sports, bringing it into arts, right? We can start to teach kids these mindfulness practices in all of those ways, and you can feel free to check out my other work on that as well, not to shamelessly plug myself, but there's a lot of good work in that department. So thank you guys both so much. This has been great. Thank you, not both. I mean, looks like a lot of folks in the crowd. Thank you for your great questions. Feel free to stay in touch with me. Thank you.
This is Karen again, and Dr. Willard, I'd like to thank you. We are so pleased that you were able to join us. You answered so many wonderful questions, and this has been a great session. For our participants, we are so glad that you were able to join us, and just to let you know, our next webcast will be coming up in April with, again, it will be part of our Educator edition, and we will be sending out information to you on that shortly, so keep checking your email boxes. There will be more to come.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And to our audience, just so you know, we will be having our survey. We value your opinion. We value your thoughts. The survey helps us to better meet your needs and to plan our programming with content that you are looking for. So again, Dr. Willard, I want to thank you. I want to thank our audience. This has been a terrific experience. I know that I have thoroughly enjoyed hearing you, and I believe that our audience has also.
Great.
So thank you. And I will be opening our polls now.